It's not every day that you get to follow an Indian prince but we'll do our best, and we have a very distinguished panel to do so, to talk about defining the business case for LGBT inclusion, in a way a continuation of some of the conversations that we were having earlier. Just to get my Ronald Nee on my immediate left is the head of private wealth management for Asia Pacific at Goldman Sachs. Laura Atherley, global head of senior relationship management at Nomura, and Martin Cubban, corporate development and finance director with SWA Pacific. Could we start with you, Martin, perhaps, and tell us about the business case at SWA and really why it hasn't been self-evident hitherto. Does one have to make the business case, and what is the blinding business case that you see at SWA?
Well, maybe we should start with the second part of that question, which is why has it not been so obvious and apparent to the board and the seniors in SWA hitherto? And I think people in the audience, society in general, will be amazed at just how naive people like me really are. And people like me are sort of white, middle-aged, stroke old, male, heterosexual, and have been the beneficiaries of a relatively prejudice-free upbringing. And therefore, the issues and the problems faced by the LGBT community are just simply not appreciated by many on boards of directors populated by people like me, and there are lots of them all around the world, and SWIRE is absolutely no exception. So although I think all of my colleagues on the board of SWIRE Pact would see themselves as open, liberal, and supportive of LGBT issues, they simply don't know what their own body language and approach to life is doing to inhibit what I would describe as a more meritocratic business community. Which leads on to, I guess, the first question, which is, what is the case? I mean, if you talk to any business people, certainly in this part of the world, but maybe all over the world, it's one of the most resounding and most obvious comments you're going to get is that it's ever more competitive. If people ask you, what do you think of 2016? Oh, it's going to be challenging. We hear it all the time. What it really means is that, the world is getting more meritocratic, and therefore any privileges, any benefits you have by your position, your history, are being quickly eroded. And therefore, that's a good thing. That makes society better. But it means that you've got to move with it. And if you're not, then you risk being compromised, you risk being outcompeted. And I say the core of that is demonstrating that you are meritocratic, that you encourage and obtain the best of talent around the world, around different communities, because you'll need it to survive going forward. And as I say, I'm not trying to say that SWIREs have been the beneficiary of just outrageous good luck. I think over many periods of our history we have been very meritocratic, but I think it is the nature of the makeup of the seniors in our organisation which has perhaps allowed us not to be more encouraging of a number of communities, not just LGBT, dare I say it, ladies. If you look around the board of SWIRE Pacific, again, not enough executive directors who are ladies. I mean, and it's partly to do with our own upbringing and a lack of positive discrimination. That's a very bad timing as well, actually. It's probably my wife.
She heard you. Someone complaining about the... But what you describe, what you describe fascinatingly is that the SWIRE is such a venerable brand, and one thinks of all the traditions, and you describe that perhaps with the best will in the world, unconsciously you come into a culture which isn't as conducive as you would like to inclusiveness. How do you set about, or how did you set about trying to shift things? What sort of steps can you take to change a culture?
I think I use the phrase sort of positive discrimination. I think you simply have to go out and begin to change not just some of the traditions, rules, and nature of employment contracts. You've got to be seen to be reasonably vocal as well in the broader community, and it's incumbent on people like me in companies around the world to do just that. In a sense, much of my own sort of epiphany in this regard really came about because of young people in Swires who had the confidence to come forth and say, look, Martin, I don't know how you think you present yourself, and we think you're a nice enough guy, but much of how you project yourselves doesn't suggest to me that you are, by nature, inclusive of the LGBT community. And I was taken aback, shocked by that. And once you delve into it, you recognize that there are aspects of how you live your life and how you project yourself which could be deemed to be not encouraging of other groups. And I was aghast at that notion, and so it started for me anyway in sort of encouraging younger people in Swires who have at least, I think, the confidence and also the cogence of how they explain their case, because they have been prejudiced against, to begin to change attitudes and views.
Did you do any sort of surveys to capture attitude or sort of measure how you were performing on this?
No, I wouldn't say we've got sort of hard empirical evidence, but the case made by enough people I believe are thoughtful and sensible convinced me that unquestionably we are not projecting an environment which is the most inclusive. And I think it sort of translates itself. And I, when I first got this sense, I sort of looked back at my own history in Swires and think of people I knew who were from an LGBT community and how they went through their own careers. And what I saw, what I observed, was self-censorship. So instead of sort of having the confidence to push themselves forward for, selection to higher positions, they were clearly concerned to do that. And I can think of a number of people who were clearly very, very talented, who I'm not saying there was a glass ceiling, but they themselves, through self-censorship, created a glass ceiling to some degree. And they said, I'm happy here, I'm doing okay, but I'm not prepared to come out because I'm worried about what my colleagues, my contemporaries might think of me. And unquestionably, that inhibited them getting to the top, because it is the nature, I think, in most communities, most societies, most businesses, you tend to find the people who talk a lot about themselves, who project themselves, who are prepared to take a position on things, they're the ones who tend to get promoted. That is the nature of, the Darwinian nature of business, I would say.
Laura, if I could turn to you, I guess a lot of that would resonate with you.
I'm not totally sure if you can hear me. So.
Yeah, we can. I think we can hear you. Can we hear you? We'll take a mic. We might be more comfortable.
Thank you. So
there you go.
So yes, I think it does. And having run the Women's Network, I worked very closely with LGBT, and I think Nomura is actually quite pioneering. We recommend, we recognise that diversity of thought, a room of homogenous people, doesn't give you creativity, it doesn't give you innovation, and it doesn't give you talent. And I think we're working hard on our talent program. In 2008, Nomura bought Lehman. Lehman had been doing a great deal of work on LGBT, and Nomura continued it. So in 2010, we introduced a code of conduct. It was around discrimination, and it was internal policy. But we trained all of our middle managers who had perhaps a dated opinion of how it would impact the workforce. So we now have a code of conduct. We have an LGBT community in Japan and in Asia. In Japan, it may surprise you that Abenomics is driving culture. We now have a diversity committee that reports directly to the board. We do track statistics. We do look at how it's improving in terms of productivity. And a lot of people today have talked about productivity. I read a statistic that 26% of LGBT employees feel sadness at work, and that 34% feel that they sacrifice some kind of personality, again, through the framework that we have. And everyone talks about increased productivity when we have a better workforce. The science behind this is really interesting. The brain works on something called the CNS system. It's neurotransmitters, it's neuropeptides, and something called steroid stress mediators. Those three make up the CNS system, and they allow us to learn, they allow us to grow our memory, and they control emotional intelligence. And if you are stressed at work, and if you are sad at work, your CNS system becomes impaired. So from our perspective, I think if you haven't got people working to the best of their ability, you are suffering from your business.
Well, I've learned among other things, two things from that. Firstly, that was all neuroscience is fascinating, but also that the global financial crisis resulted in Nomura acquiring policies here which it might not otherwise have had, which is an unexpected side effect, I guess.
And could I just add one point to that? We recently had a gay parade in Tokyo, and a group of LGBT employees from Nomura joined the parade. They wore red kimonos with Nomura on the back. From the result of that event, our branding completely changed. Nomura was no longer seen as a traditional firm, and our recruitment and people signing up to come and look at Nomura has changed dramatically. I thought that was extremely positive.
And the fact that the Diversity Committee reports directly to the board, are you seeing results from that sort of
I will share with you.
line to the top?
Yes, it's relatively new. It's been in the last 6 months. They report directly to the group CEO. And Nagai-san, our CEO, actually meets with Abe very regularly, both on the economic policy, but what is known as the fourth arrow. So people talk about the arrows in Japan. The fourth is around culture. And there is a lot of discussion around how we change the culture in firms, and there's a lot of discussion around what code of conduct really means.
So when you say that Abenomics is driving diversity, that's what you mean. Yeah.
So it's around female diversity, LGBT, age demographic, religious demographic, all of those 4 points, and we do track them. We do have statistics.
Ron, if I could turn to you, how does all this square with what you've experienced and Goldman?
Well, I guess there's two parts of it, and I think that Laura and Martin have touched on a lot of it. To the neuroscience of it all, I think the output of that, the way we look at it is, some of the studies, and I think it was mentioned in the video previously, is that the increase in productivity when people of LGBT orientation can be themselves is anywhere between 15 and 30% uplift in productivity. And people in Hong Kong work pretty hard, and we work pretty hard at Goldman Sachs, and so say we work 6 days a week, 30% uplift is 2 free days every week. So that's a pretty significant case on the face of it. I think there's a public aspect to it as well. In terms of our brand, we think it's very important for us to be on the right side of what might be the biggest sort of social issue of our time. And in terms of what we've been doing about it, I really, the way that Martin describes it really resonates a lot with me personally, because I think that a lot of this is around you don't know what you don't know. And I'm the co-chair of Goldman's diversity efforts in the region, and I didn't get asked to do that because I was particularly aligned to women's causes or LGBT causes. I think my boss at the time observed me to be obedient and energetic, and he said, could you please take this on? And so I got involved because I kind of reminded him of his dog, I think, actually. So I got involved on that basis, and so I was grossly unqualified to deal with some of these things. And one of the things we do for the enhancement of the culture internally for LGBT is we sponsor Q Night, which some people here may know as a quiz night, which is cross-industry, and it's a pretty popular event. And my colleagues asked me in my capacity as chair of diversity to get up and sort of give a toast. And I got up and I told a story about how one of my clients was describing going to pick up one of his friends after school with the only briefing that his friend was a boy and his name was Johnny or something like this. And when my client showed up at the playground to pick up his son, he told one of the teachers, look, I don't know who this kid is, but he's named Johnny. And the teacher pointed out the boy in the corner and said, yeah, that's him over there, and he was black. And it never occurred to his son to describe his friend as black. And I said, look, this to me sort of is a good example of what we should aspire to as it relates to the cause for LGBT, that it doesn't become a big deal. Well, fast forward, there was another event where we had another speaker come internally, and they said, look, would you mind introducing this person? I said, yeah, okay, what do you want me to say? I said, well, just talk about some experience and how you think about the LGBT thing. And he's here, Paul Choi. I said, Paul, well, you were at this Q night where I told this story about the client, his son, and the black friend, and how, we hope that that's, where we can get to with LGBT. He goes, I didn't really like that story. And I said, why didn't you like it? I mean, people clapped after I told the story. They thought it was funny. They thought it was good, sort of inspirational, uplifting. He said, it's the opposite, because people who are lesbian or gay or bisexual, transgender, it's not visible. And what we're trying to do is to help them make it visible and let them be themselves, because people perform better when they can be themselves. And I said, oh my God, I screwed it up, and so there is that learning that we're going through. And I think that, a lot of what we're doing at Goldman is about trying to make what is invisible visible. So to Martin's point about like your body language and this kind of thing, one of the things we've done is we have these tents. It's a little plastic thing about this big, and people put it on their desk and it says, I'm an ally. And so of the managing directors, we have, 50 or 60 who have these things on their desks. And it's basically to let people who know who are in the closet that if you come to me, I'm an ally, and we can talk about this. We also had an event which we were surprised by the uptake, which was around the Pink Dot event. We had a Pink Friday, and we had 1,600 people in our office here in Hong Kong wearing pink T-shirts on the back, sort of talking about what their connection was to LGBT. And the visual effect of the tent and the T-shirt, I think, those are some of the things, in addition to the network events and the conversations we try to have around the topic, that we're trying to do to bolster what I think is a quite compelling business case.
What about the, as it were, the Asia-specific elements or stage of things? If you were to, you're obviously par excellence global company. You presumably have your own conversations around these issues with your European, US colleagues, and so on. Is it distinctive here in terms of the sorts of activities you do and the sorts of case you have to make, or is it just a question of stage of development?
I think that it's more a stage of development thing. And I think that, again, listening to the video before the panel, this notion that it has to come from the top is quite important. And so, as you say, we're a global company, but the fact that our CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, was very vocal as it relates to our commitment to having an inclusive environment. And I think that's probably the more central narrative, which is, I think that LGBT for us fits into a broader narrative of wanting to have an inclusive workplace. And that cost us some business and some clients, but I think the leadership from the top, from our headquarters, sort of percolates into the field. But I do think we're earlier in the piece.
Does it win you more than it costs you overall?
Well, we think so.
That's the
We
belief.
think so, yeah. And I think that one of my colleagues joined us from another firm, and she talks about how, when she was at her previous firm, she was expected to dress a particular way, and, ladylike, I guess, whatever that means. And, she came to Goldman, and she sort of got the sense that we don't really care how she dresses as long as it's professional. She dresses very well, as far as I'm concerned. And so I think that that's an example of how in Asia, I'm not as familiar with what it's like in the States, but certainly, it's uneven in Asia as it relates to how our employees, or how employees experience the inclusiveness of, the firms that they can work at. And I think Martin really hit it on the head, which is, at some level, we see that as a competitive advantage. But on the other hand, this is one of those things I think is probably, we're quite happy for other people to be excellent in terms of having inclusive work environments as well. But, as long as they don't, then we're very fortunate to have this particular woman on our team because she feels more comfortable with us than she did at our previous firm.
There's an interesting question from the app here that, and I should, by the way, have said that I see that we're being watched in many, many countries. A list flashed up on the screen here, a little bit earlier. So we should remember that in the room, that this isn't just here. But this is a question, I believe, from the room. LGBT diversity is something large businesses might have the resources to spend on, but is it realistic to expect smaller organizations to keep up too?
Yes.
So please do also submit your questions via the app if you'd like to, that we're happy to take those. But what do you think about that?
I wholeheartedly agree. I think it has to be everybody. I read a report that was presented at Davos, and they had coded countries, yellow, green and red. And I think LGBT has to adapt to its environment. I'm afraid I like the Darwin quote, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, or the most intelligent is those adaptable to change. And I think that's what we're doing at Nomura, adapting to each of the environments. But when it comes to business, the cost is huge. When we do recruiting at Nomura, but in the financial industry, we spend tens of millions of dollars on recruiting. So are we attracting the right talent? Are we speaking out for LGBT? Are we speaking out for diversity, full stop? I think the answer's not enough. And the second thing is the cost of a seat in doing business, whether you're a small business or you're a big business, is very high. Putting somebody in a pension scheme, taking them out of the pension scheme, the litigious documentation that's involved. I've heard that in the financial industry, it can be as high as $100,000. So we are not doing enough for creating a safe environment that people want to come to work and stay at work. And that doesn't matter whether you're a big firm or you're a small firm. I think every single one of us is accountable. I fully agree that it starts at the top, but it also starts with us in this room. I'm sure you all saw this week that Sam Smith won an Oscar for a song he wrote for James Bond. James Bond. I'm sorry, the most stereotypical movie you can possibly see. And he stood up and did his presentation, and I thought how proud I was. He came out and spoke about how proud he was to be gay, and the media afterwards said they didn't support him. They commented, "You're not the first person to win an Oscar that's gay." We all have to support each other. There is a lovely quote, Madeleine Albright, it was in Time magazine this week. There's a special place in hell for women that don't help other women. I feel the same about LGBT. We're all here to help each other.
Another good question, related question, I think, from the app. Perhaps, Martin, I can ask you to take this one. How can we get local companies in Asia more involved in LGBT inclusion? And obviously, you have a big range of companies within the group, but this is more about local companies.
It is, yeah. Although I think often for many sort of societal issues of the day, some of the emphasis for change often comes from right-thinking people speaking up in the community. That's probably been evident in the last sort of 5 years on issues of climate change. It's very evident here in Hong Kong with regard to the need for political change. It's the movement of a large number of people expressing their clearly thought-out views that you need to be positive and be inclusive of all communities, not least LGBT. And the sooner that pressure is felt by society, by business people, whether they be big businesses or small businesses, the sooner people will begin to react. And of course, it's happened around the world, though there are still problems with regard to race discrimination. But surely, the fact that this is clearly abhorrent as a behavior and as well counterproductive from a business point of view, it's beginning to change attitudes. And I think it's the same with LGBT. So it's actually, as Laura said, it's mobilizing a larger group of people to get behind this. And I say, I see it most obviously in the younger generation, not because they've got a larger number of people who discriminate it.
This has been a recurring theme today, the younger generation, but I'm wondering also, and from your perspective of having a sort of portfolio, is there also a sectoral difference here, that some industries are more naturally, for example, the entertainment industry, the hotel industry, the travel industry, it seems to be way out in front if you look at a lot of the indices on this, and some other industries probably much slower to evolve.
It's been very helpful in Swires, truthfully, in that two of the businesses we have, which are reasonably well known and certainly worldwide respected, Cathay Pacific and our hotels group, unquestionably have some very, very able, creative, bright people from the LGBT community. And that's, people are aware of that because they're more apt at coming out and saying who they are and what they stand for. And what they've done in a business sense is self-evident. I think, we, without fear of contradiction, and I run a property business, not the hotel or the airline, but those two businesses do stand out as being probably the more creative in the Swire Group, and ones we are rightly proud of. And it's also not an accident that they're probably the most meritocratic.
Martin, do you have a...
Well, I do think that it doesn't really matter whether it starts from, the business impulse being targeting your customers, or whether you're sort of focused on your employees. I think it's, sort of both. It doesn't really matter, sort of white cat, black cat, as long as it catches a mouse type thing. I think that the questions, I just want to come back to the earlier questions though, because, the two questions sort of come at this notion that LGBT is something that is good for big, well-funded companies or international companies where the acceptance of LGBT might be higher. I actually think for us, if I think that about the biggest trend of where we're losing talent, it's to small local companies. And if you think that creating an inclusive environment is a cultural thing, I actually think small local companies in a way have an advantage of changing their culture. They're more nimble than large companies that are just harder to move. The PT boat versus the super tanker, it's just harder. And so I actually would look at it slightly the opposite way, which is, I think, whether you're a small company or a local company or a small local company, that may actually be a great advantage in this area.
Can we actually put that to the people in this room? I think that's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it so that you can do a yes/no answer to this. But whether I want to get at the idea of whether small companies or big companies have the natural advantage in being leaders in this area. So let me put it this way. Do big companies, put it the other way around than you put it, so as not to lead the audience, do big companies have an advantage over small companies in leading the way for LGBT inclusion? I would score that about even, wouldn't you?
It's pretty mixed.
Yeah.
Pretty mixed. Interesting. Surprising, actually. But maybe your advocacy beforehand steered things in that direction. But okay. Perhaps leading on from my previous question, the question from the app, how do we reach out to industries beyond finance and services like manufacturing and heavy industry? So I was asking you, Martin, about within the group there is differentiation in the industry. Perhaps manufacturing and heavy industry isn't as far advanced. What can you do to change attitudes in those industries?
Well, in truth, we're not very involved in heavy industry. We do have a bottling business. I guess it touches manufacturing. But also an integral part of the Swire culture and business model is to have a pool of management who are moved around. And so being very sort of clear about that process, ensuring that people from all walks of life get exposure to all businesses and proselytize their message is something which has happened and continues to happen. I say it's standalone businesses where one slightly worries about making that drive, which is why I go back to it probably starts from a wider section of society, just making it clear that your behavior is abhorrent, and make that sort of conventional wisdom in people's thinking, that you need to sort of be aware of these issues, and you need to be aware of your history and how it can sort of conflict with with what are reasonable human rights type goals, and conflict with your business goals too.
Any questions from the floor? Indeed, comments. I'm very interested in examples or sort of stories of your own experiences. There's obviously a lot of experience in the room, and those are very interesting to hear about. So any questions or comments from the floor? I see any? Yeah. One here and one here. Let's come. There's, yes, maybe. I'll come to you after.
Hi, I'm Maureen DeRoy from ABN AMRO. Just wanted to ask you, since you're all very active in your companies, have you reached out to the communities, to the governments of the countries where you do business, and discuss these matters?
I think that we, if we don't reach out to the government, the government's come and find us, actually. So we, just out of necessity, are reasonably public, and people are interested in our posture as it relates to these things. So I think that's sort of all in the normal course of our activities. And I think, starting with the fact of being a regulated entity, it's a very interesting thing. Speaking of, maybe it's a slightly different direction. We did have a regional regulator come to us and ask us about our diversity policies, because they have a hypothesis that companies that are more diverse are better risk managers. And so they observe that, we're very committed to risk management for ourselves and for our clients, and we're very committed to diversity, and they wanted to understand, what is the intersection between inclusive, diverse workforces and risk management. And we very much believe that, because the place where you get yourself into trouble is where you get groupthink, and the groupthink tends to arise in direct correlation to the homogeneity of the people sitting around the table arguing about a particular topic. So that probably is the most proximate nexus of our interaction with governments, is that kind of thing. It's caught their attention, and they've engaged in a dialogue about it with us.
And of course, Laura, you talked about
Japan
Abe.
regulator, Arbenomics. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think it's Arbenomics, but it's also driven by the regulator. And we're seeing across the globe some regulators much more actively involved than others. And the PRA in the UK under Mark Carney, I feel, are actually one of the leaders. And the conduct and culture program that they're driving, they are coming into the building, they are looking at our networks. We actually have culture criteria set by the PRA. And interesting to me is that the JFSA are now actively meeting with the PRA to discuss culture. So I don't think we're doing it at the government level, except in Japan.
You have to
Oh.
Explain the acronyms for some people in the room.
So the regulators in the UK and the regulators in Japan for banking and securities are actively they're actually setting us criteria around culture. And we touched on a couple of interesting points around how you take it out of finance. It's also about transferring managers from one place to another. Because I think if you work in the UK, you run the culture program and you work with the regulator, and then you're transferred to another area, another country, you take those best practices with you.
I think there was a question, yeah, over here.
I'm Ryan from HR Magazine. I remember basically hearing a lot about sort of how some people stumbled across these kind of incentive to be more inclusive of LGBT people, but there will still be people in the company, maybe in higher levels of the company, that might still not be converted. So how do what kind of specific strategies have your companies done to kind of convert the unconverted, so to speak?
I think it's a real age demographic. I think it's interesting that in Japan, below 29-year-olds are more accepting of LGBT than any nation in the world, including the US and Europe. That statistic surprised me. But I think we find that in Asia in particular, more people come out in the office than they do with their families. And again, it's because of this demographic. So how we approached it was doing training for middle management, which tended to be of above 40, very male, very traditional. And we did a number of different programs, getting in speakers, almost acting out parts, going through the conversations. I mean, it's not been easy, but I think you have to put it in the metrics. So we put it in year-end evaluations now, that culture and code of conduct is a percentage of your scorecard at the year end and will change your remuneration. And I think that, if you don't mind me saying, I think sometimes money talks.
Can I put a sort of provocative question to you? We're almost out of time, but for the final question, which is to listen to this and perhaps to some of the conversations earlier, because we're to some extent preaching by and to the converted. It seems so obvious, right? Who could possibly object to the business case? And yet, it's not so simple as you were just suggesting. So where does the opposition come from and what can you do about it? So is the opposition unconscious opposition or conscious opposition? Where are the real barriers?
Well, it sounds a weak response, but I mean, I think a lot of it, and still in my own company, is inertia. It's just, it's taking time to change attitudes. I mean, if I was to answer that question just asked, I'd struggle. What are we doing which, in a sense, penalizes or rewards those who have the good or the bad attitudes? We simply don't do enough. And I was going to add to a question that Ron answered earlier with regard to the regulatory environment and governments generally. Actually, for a public corporation, the most important regulator is the shareholder. So those of you who work for fund management companies out there, I mean, there are increasingly number of sustainability-oriented funds. And as Ron says, many of them do look at issues of diversity in the organisation. But that's where you can bring about pressure to organisations. You really can. When you appear there, don't just ask about what rent you're getting in a specific place, but what are you doing about diversity? Tell me specifically what you're doing to encourage a meritocratic society in these areas. And you'll have to answer it. Otherwise, they'll sell the shares and that ain't good.
I think
Very briefly, because
very quickly, activist shareholders could play a good part in this. I understand that Al Gore in his fund now will only invest in funds that have a diverse board. That could really push the inertia.
Ron, last word.
I think the biggest enemy over here is ignorance. And that's probably, the sister enemy to inertia. And I think that, overcoming those two, you're probably a long way there. And I think events like this are probably pretty positive if they will spawn, people going out and educating people and inspiring people. And so I think those are probably the most significant barriers to getting to where we want to get to on the topic.
Well, I think what's clear is that inertia and ignorance, they're just two words, but they're very, very, very powerful forces in practice. So very interesting to hear about your efforts to combat them, and I think there's a lot of insight there for everyone to take back. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you too.
Pleasure.